why do you think you say it's not the thing that companies are banging down your door to talk to, bipolar research? I experienced the same. What are we so scared of?
I do think that if I think about the average middle manager right now, they're pretty overwhelmed, and the overwhelm is increased lately. And I think this sounds like a big, thorny, long-term problem that they're not ready to deal with. And I understand that. I mean, I think we all are looking for a way to simplify our life and simplify the getting the work done. And so what we were trying to do when we wrote this article was basically tell managers that avoiding a problem doesn't make it go away, essentially, if that's what you consider this to be. And that, the rates of incidents are high enough that for most managers, you're already dealing with people, whether they have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder or anxiety or depression or borderline personality disorder or any of the other ones. Like, the reality is undoubtedly there are people in your organization with these diagnoses. And it's not this big scary thing that you can't deal with. In fact, one of the best parts about this whole project for me was talking to people who had this really great relationship with their manager, because the way they described that, it was certainly fulfilling and supportive and helpful for the individual with the diagnosis. But I'm imagining the other side, like that other manager, the person on the other side, the manager is also probably sitting there thinking like, wow, like I can have a real connection with this employee. Like, we are rolling up our sleeves together, working on something that's important and personal and difficult, but we are doing it together in a way that must make them feel great. I mean, I know as a manager, for me, if I feel like I can genuinely be helpful to someone who works for me and we're both accomplishing the work that we're trying to do together, it's even better. You want to have that kind of sense of effectiveness as a manager.
Oh, for sure. You study loneliness at work, and one of the things that in your writings I noticed you saying a couple times is that people with disabilities, people with differences report feeling lonelier at work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, there's so much still stigma and hidden shame that is associated with having something like a mental health condition or other. By the way, this also happens for other types of conditions that may be hidden, whether it's lupus or diabetes or some other physical condition as well that people don't want to talk about at work. And so that alone creates this shell around people that I think can contribute to loneliness. But even if people are open about what's going on with them, if they feel like they're the only person who is dealing with this, if others are not coming forward or sharing their own struggles, that also can contribute to loneliness. And then, finally, I would say, loneliness at work in particular, most people who we talk to aren't saying like, I wish people liked me more, which is often what's the assumption.
Right.
It's actually, I wish people saw me more. I wish people would recognize who I am and the glories that I can offer, as well as the limitations and struggles that I have. And so if you're hiding part of your background, or if you're sharing it and people are not allowing you to manifest that in a way, whether it's, again, this collaborative problem solving approach, like let's help me and let's work together, and then therefore I will also be able to help you. It's just it's really discouraging. It's something that people carry with them. And we know from the work on loneliness that it has all these sorts of bottom line implications as well. So companies, again, I always try to remind companies that it's not just an altruistic motive you should
It's
take.
not nice. Right, right.
Like, this is actually beneficial to you, your team, your company as well. Lonely employees don't do their best work. They leave more frequently. They can also create a sense of loneliness among others through this implicit contagion process. So, it really is something that is beyond the individual. I think that's one of the biggest messages that I hope my research in general, regardless of what topic I'm covering, gets out there, which is like, it's not you, it's them. Like, I wouldn't simplify it to that level, but it is like, it's it's an individual problem, but it requires a collective solution. And therefore, if you have a bunch of individual problems that requires collective solutions, it becomes a collective problem. Like, this is something we should all work on.
I find that inspiring. I studied with Marshall Gantz when I was at Harvard, and he's a famous organizer. And, he has a framework for collective action, which is that, I have the story of me and you have the story of you, but we have common threads. It becomes the story of us. And when it becomes the story of us, we all seek solution. And how I feel about mental health and differences at work is that I may have bipolar and someone else might have ADHD, but we all have a story. If there's one thing I know after having people tell me all their stories for 17 years, it's that everybody has a story. Yeah. Everyone's hiding something.
Yeah, everyone's hiding something. I think everyone's struggling with something in the darkness a bit, and I like your collective organizing framework, and Marshall Gantz's work is truly, what I think transforming workplaces will require is this sense of collective action.
Yeah.
That we are doing this together. It is not a one-off, like, oh, let me take this one employee with this one situation and help accommodate them.
Right.
I mean, that's an insufficient and sometimes damaging approach.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your research that you did with 2 other colleagues on people who are bipolar professionals, successful people at work. What was the big aha? Did you have any, before we get into your advice, what was surprising to you?
And first, I do want to mention by name my collaborators, Zahoria Jazairi, who's a clinical psychologist. And I think that's important. Well, first of all, she's a fantastic colleague, but also because we did have someone with clinical training behind this research. I think it's a responsible thing to do. And Hilary Enger-Elfenbein, who herself is a rock star in her field in organizational behavior, and studies a lot about emotions at work and cultures. I'll just speak for myself, not for the 3 of us, but for myself, what was the first thing that was most surprising was how many little ways people had figured out a solution for themselves. It wasn't like the one thing. There were lots of different things that they were doing, and there were a lot of consistent patterns across people, and that led to our advice. So that was the positive surprise, I guess I would say, is it's, it really is possible to sort of craft jobs in a way with multiple initiatives that can make it work for people. But the other thing that was a surprise, that was a discouraging surprise, was I somehow hoped we would hear fewer stories about people being mistreated or rejected based on their disclosure. Most of the stories, I will say, were in the past. So, these are stories tend to be 5, 10, even 20 years ago that people told us, but everyone had a story. Yeah. And, that was unfortunate and was something I was not hoping to hear.
That doesn't surprise me. I hear even today, people being punished. Did the leaders that you spoke with have complex relationships with their bipolar identity?
They did. And some people we talked to hadn't talked to people at work about it. They had crafted their accommodations and workarounds indirectly. And others were more open about it. So the identity piece, for one, was striking between those 2 groups, the people who had disclosed and not. I mean, the people who had not disclosed had much more, one of them in particular was quite negative in terms of describing himself. Although he would often say, like, I don't feel this way, but other people feel this way about those with bipolar disorder. So this was not an identity that he was willing to go public with. The people who were more public, some refer to it as the gift of bipolar, or, giving them superpowers. So they had really embraced some of the known positive attributes that often go along with this condition. Things like super empathetic, these people, some refer to themselves as empaths, really being able to pick up on the emotions of others. Others talked about being able to see things that others couldn't see. One talked about how he predicted where, and this is something to do with parallel computing, and I cannot explain it to you, but he had somehow seen that this was where computer science was headed, before others, and made the leap into that field early on. Others were talked about their incredible just energy and power of persuasion. Many of them had roles that involved them, whether it's fundraising for one person we talked to in the finance world, or recruiting, and their ability to just like really go out there and find the right people and match them up. And so there were so many parts of the identity that people highlighted that they attributed to having the bipolar disorder. But they also, talked about themselves as some of them as like mental health advocates, and feeling a sense of responsibility to also talk about the positives of having a mental health condition in many different types with other people. So they had gone and given corporate talks, for example, about what they had learned. Others were part of mentorship programs where they were open for business for people who wanted to talk about whatever their mental health condition was and give them their advice. And so some of them took the entire kind of cluster of, if you think about like neurodiversity or the mental health spectrum, as part of their identity, and really leveraged that as well in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that rings true. It's funny. I mean, people always say to me, how do you get so much done? I have like 7 jobs and 3 kids and, all the things. And I said, well, I'm bipolar. Like I spend a good portion of my life hypomanic.
Mm.
And, as Paul English, the famous entrepreneur, always says, you could bottle hypomania and sell it for $1 million.
Yeah.
That's how good it is. Now, unfortunately, there are real downsides, and I'm very well managed with medication and therapy and all the skills. But the essence of being bipolar to me is a very expansive essence at its best. And that's amazing.
Yeah, I'm curious that there was sort of a saying among clinical psychologists that like, if only we could all be hypomanic, once in a while, after treating people, because it does. I mean, I haven't experienced that myself, but I have had moments or periods where I've had that extra burst of energy. And, it is one of those things where you think, wow, like, gosh, I could solve the world's problems if I just, had this all the time. So I can imagine how that's very helpful.
And again, I'm so lucky in that I have a pretty mild case, but you feel that you can solve all the world's problems. So you take on so much, and then you have a little bit of a hangover where you're like, I did say yes to that. I did start that. One of the things that I always joke about, which is a real thing in my community, is like we all own like 500 domain names.
Oh, really?
Because you just never know when you're going to start that business, right? Or do that project. It's like, oh, that's a great domain name. I'm just going to buy the domain name, because that's how your mind works.
Right.
Which can be very exhausting to other people, actually.
Yes. Yes, it can. Although everyone we talked to was trying to figure out how to leverage those hypomanic phases because they wanted to, because they did have that incredible energy and creativity and insight that they wanted to harness without being exploited. So the other thing that we learned a lot about is, it's hard enough to manage your own levels of energy and hypomania and making sure it doesn't go into mania and making sure it doesn't trigger, acute depression. But once others know about it, do they start thinking about, oh, hey, Maura, guess what? I'm going to give you triple the work because we know you can do it.
Right.
So, I think that's the other thing. When you have the ability to have a real open conversation with your employer, is being able to say, here are the ways that we're both going to benefit from the condition and the attributes that go with it. But here are also the ways I need to protect myself. And I need you to understand that, while it may seem like I have unstoppable energy, like it does come at a cost at some point.
That's right.
And it's not good for either of us if it goes too far.
And that's where I think also the self-esteem piece, you mentioned that, I mean, a lot of people did have complicated relationships,
Mhm.
right? Where, if you've been in a place where you've been punished for it, or you've
Yeah.
felt othered or stigmatized, then not having the boundaries and the ability to say, you know what, not right now, thanks. That's not good for me, which is
Yeah.
hard for all of us to do anyway, can be extra hard. So you got to work on your own self and your self-concept too.
Yeah, and this is another dominant theme that came out of this research, but how critical it is for the person to know themselves and and have the ability to communicate their needs and their preferences,
Yeah.
and the watch outs that may come with that. And I think that, as you said, that's hard for everybody. I mean, I'm still working on that in my own life. When I teach MBA students, I always assign this classic article by Peter Drucker, famous management scholar, and it's called Managing Oneself.
Yeah.
And it's timeless because we're all still forgetting to do that, but the basic premises is really understanding your strengths, but also the conditions that allow you to do your best work. And that can be very, functional, practical aspects like a loud room versus quiet room, morning versus day. Are you a reader or are you more of an auditory learner? Like all that stuff. We have to do the work and the experiments to be able to figure it out for ourselves before we can ask others to help us. Yeah. And I think, for those with bipolar disorder, you talked about self-esteem, often the self-esteem gets hit because as they were growing up, or maybe it was a late onset, towards in their 20s, for example, people have already had experience of being punished or having failures or other issues associated with it that can erode that. And so I wish I had a magic wand where I can make everybody have enough self-esteem to know, no, you still deserve, to be enabled to thrive. But I think before you can ask others, like I said, you have to figure out what you need for yourself too. And I hope everyone is pushing on that journey, even though I don't think we're ever done with it. But I think, waiting for someone to save you or someone to figure it out for you is just not going to work.
It's not, of course, many people have said this before me, but I think especially for those of us with tricky brains, the process of working on your self-actualization is more important than anything, because you can only be yourself, and you can work really hard to not be yourself, but it's just going to create misery. And so creating a life by which you understand your values, understand what good looks like, all those things is really the only way to freedom and happiness,
Right.
It's the only way. It's hard.
It is hard. And it also changes over time. I mean, you and I know at this point in our lives and our careers, like also our preferences can evolve and our needs can evolve and our abilities also can evolve too. So, you're never done. It's just like, you might as well just commit to it now. Like self-actualization is it's critical and you got to keep at it.
So Connie, you had some great advice based on the research, and I'd love you to walk us through. The first is, of course, one of our favorites. I think it's sleep.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also this was an article we wrote for Harvard Business Review. So we should be clear. We were talking to the leaders of companies who are the primary readers of this. And I can kind of iterate between the leaders sort of messaging and what the individual who may not have full leadership support can do. But I would say, we found there were three major buckets that are helpful. The first one is modifying the job features, and sleep is one aspect of that. So I'll come back to that. The second one is training managers. And again, like if I'm just an individual employee, I can't command my manager to go get training. But I think that's important to get that message out there. There's a lot that can be trained and taught that will be helpful here. And then the final thing is really promoting the right kind of culture, which is a combination of high performance standards. We don't want to let up on those, as well as compassion and flexibility. So, I think there are things that everybody can do individually and as leaders within each of those buckets. But going back to the first one, the modifying job features, sleep, and you know this, like, it is so critical for all of us as human beings to require that to continue to grow brain cells and recover from injuries and so forth. But particularly with people with a bipolar disorder condition, they just know that this is a condition that's very vulnerable to sleep disruption. It can trigger, believe it or not, people don't always understand this. They think a lack of sleep automatically would create depression, but it tends to trigger mania, actually. And so people need to have regular sleep schedules, the right amount of sleep, the right volume, the right volume of sleep, the right quality of sleep. And so what we found in that people discovered over time in living with a bipolar disorder at work is that they figured out sometimes it took a hard lesson or two, but they figured out that that was the first thing they needed to get accommodations for, is I cannot miss sleep because I'm traveling, or I can't miss sleep because I'm working 15-hour days, or I can't miss sleep because I've switched time zones and now I'm 7 hours off my schedule. And that does sound like a big ask for employers, depending on the job you have, how much that's required. But that, if nothing else, people said was the key to their success at work, which is being able to maintain that kind of sleep schedule. And so that's the first thing I would say is, having a conversation about that. And again, by the way, I know you've talked about in your own podcast, like you love working weekends because it's uninterrupted. So usually you're not asking for like less hours per se. It's just a way to manage those hours to benefit your sleep. So it might be you work a 6-day work week, but if you're doing this voluntarily because it's what you want to do and because it allows you to get the sleep you need, then it's a good thing.
Yeah. It's interesting because, and I think you had an example of a management consultant in the HBR article who got some flack from colleagues, but, a lot of the high novelty jobs that people like us might be attracted to, where you're, say, a consultant, you're traveling a ton, or you're, at a startup putting in long days, ironically are tough on your sleep.
Yes,
Sort of an extra
absolutely.
element.
And I'll tell you one story that we learned about that didn't make the article that gave an example of just the power of sleep and lack of sleep. So one of the people we talked to was a recruiter during the beginning of the pandemic for a major firm. He was asked to hire 2,500 people in 3 weeks. 2,500 people. And this was to support COVID response customer service. He said, and he takes responsibility. He said, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to be manic to make this happen, so I stopped sleeping. So he deliberately put himself into sleeplessness, triggered the mania, was able to hire. He said, this assignment came on a Friday. I didn't sleep all weekend. By Monday, I'd already hired my first 150 people, had them onboarded with handbooks and so forth. And so he did that for 3 weeks and he accomplished that goal. But you can imagine what happened afterwards. He went straight into a deep depression. But I think it happens accidentally or because people are feeling like they have no choice at work as well. That's a really dramatic example, but you can imagine, being on a team where it's a sprint, folks, roll up your sleeves. Nobody's sleeping for the next few weeks. Even said in jest, that actually is like handing someone, a drug that will create a complete imbalance in their brain. Yeah. And so I think we have to understand and that's part of the manager education process, like the real connections that we have here. These are not nice to have, this idea of sleep.
Wow. That's unbelievable. I mean, the whole thing. What are some other elements of job fit that you found?
Well, this is where I found a lot of inspiration and optimism because there's this concept of job crafting. And I studied this in general because for a long time I studied people's job satisfaction and loving their job. And we know from plenty of research that the more people have the ability to kind of tinker with their tasks, and design the process of accomplishing their goals according to their their abilities and their preferences, the better the outcomes are for the company and for the person. And so this is really just a category that everyone, again, I think can benefit from. But what we saw with the people we interviewed in terms of job crafting that I hadn't really thought about before was how much they were aware of their energy levels and their capability at any given moment. I mean, and maybe this is something you do as well, but I was amazed how often like people talked about like daily, even hourly checking in with themselves to see where they are. And so they take that information, and given the ability to make choices, they will flip around what they do based on that hour's energy level.
Yep.
And so, this is something that, again, to me, if managers understood more, I think they would realize the value for everybody in doing this. But it might be that in the morning is, the time when this person has low energy. Often people said they really don't start too early in the morning. And, so maybe that's when they do the administrative stuff, right? And then don't schedule a bunch of meetings with them, like first thing at 8 a.m. You may not get the best. And so I think that was like a really great example of how people giving them some control had a huge benefit. They would get all the stuff done in a given week. It just might be in the order that the manager had originally intended or thought, or maybe, a very different sync than the other teammates who are working on similar things.
It's so funny. Yes. So I call it pace, place, space. And it is essential. All of us would like this, to be honest.
Yes.
But for a lot of us, we only function well when we have the ability to manipulate the pace at which we work, right? Some of us are crammers. Some of us like to chunk things. I know that at 4 p.m., I simply cannot work until 7 p.m. It's not happening. Some of us are space people, right? Fluorescent lights drain us, right? Ludmila Preslova, our colleague, has talked about how she turned down jobs that she really wanted and would have been great at because she was expected to be in a big office with tons of fluorescent lights and stimulation. So place is super important.
Right.
At, noise, stimulation, am I home, am I at work? And then space. And space, I think, is really underestimated. Space comes to autonomy. Is my manager going to be in my business? Am I in a very rigid system where I am expected to follow protocol a certain way? Like when you think of stories of how Silicon Valley was, 10 years ago, where developers basically could work at 3 a.m. if they wanted to, no one cared.
Right.
And no one would bother them if they met their goals. So the space in which I am able to do my work as a grown-up is really important.
I love that. I love, first of all, I'm definitely gonna quote you on that in the future.
Yeah.
That's a great framework. But the last part too about the space, it's so funny. It just reminds me of so many people we talked to at some point in the conversation said the equivalent of, I hate rules.
I hate rules.
They said, this is the thing with people with bipolar disorder. We hate rules, and of course there was variance, no one person is exactly alike the other. But yeah, I think that's right. And again, like even as you and I talk about that, this is threatening for a manager who really wants everybody to do things the same way and follow the protocols.
Yep. Yeah.
So there's a trust that has to be built that says, yeah, this person, may not do things exactly as per protocol. You, of course, want to set some, you don't want to cross ethical lines and so forth. But a lot of these rules are just based on sort of averaging what the average person would do and how much time it would take or how they do, really nonsense rules in my opinion. So the idea is, can we loosen that grip on the way we do things and just focus more on the outcomes we're trying to achieve together?
100%. And it works both ways. So a common example is if you work at a firm where you have to log your time, right? So they can bill a client. So a lot of people that I, and myself included, are allergic to that, right? I'm not responsible for telling you what I'm doing, blah, 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 right? Well, yeah, okay, cool. but this is how the firm makes money. It has
Yeah.
to tell the client Maura worked 3 hours. So it's a give and take, right? I may be allergic to it, but it's work. I have to be a big girl and log my time, right? So I think it's also important to remember that we also understand that we're in systems too, and compromise as well.
Yes, absolutely. And that also is a big theme, that we had, which is that you can't just, again, create a whole organization centered on one individual's needs.
Right.
Absolutely. And again, most people don't want that. They really don't. I think sometimes people get stuck in a rigid demand because they feel like they've tried and tried and they have no other option but to lay down the law in an ultimatum kind of sense. And this just not going to be effective, but I understand why people end up that way. But your example about the logging time, like a law firm, also reminds me of another piece of advice that we came up with from the interviews, which is most of the people we spoke to also said that administrative tasks, such as filling out timesheets, really wasn't their strong suit. I mean, who loves doing that? I can't stand that myself, but it was a particular burden and could often get in the way of the good things that the people could do. So we talked to a senior faculty member who's a researcher, and she finally went to her department and just said, look, this is taking me so much time. I can't handle doing all this administrative stuff unless you give me help with that. We're going to end up with me not getting this research done that you really, really care about. And so, I think we also want to think about, like, this isn't, to me, it's not even an example of a rule breaking, but just like even a respect and understanding the rule and inability to comply with that rule. It is, I know I need to fill out my timesheet. I just can't do
My
it.
brain does not work that way. Right. And that can create a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
It's, I love someone very much who is allergic to filling out expense reports and will accrue thousands of dollars of owed expenses
Oh,
because they just can't, and so it's real.
yeah. It's real, but you need a solution.
You need a solution, and sometimes the solutions are much simpler than we think.
Mm-hmm.
What else?
So the other thing, we talk about is really important is psychological safety. So this is something that the manager has a tremendous amount of influence over. And I'm assuming your audience is familiar with psychological safety, but just to recap there, it's this sense that this is a shared belief among members of a group or a team that this is an environment where people can take interpersonal risks. And the interpersonal risks that we often study are things like admitting mistakes, offering a new idea, challenging the status quo. But it certainly would also be something like saying, hey, I can't work the way you're working to do my best. Like, I need an accommodation, or even just saying, like, I have a mental health condition that may affect my ability to show up in the same way that you would like. So that's very risky. Anything in an environment and at work is so fraught because it impacts your reputation, your future earnings, the status you have in the world. So, people are super, super conservative about taking those risks. And you have to really overcompensate as a manager to create an environment where people will still speak up despite that. And so psychological safety is a concept that, I spent a lot of time sort of writing about and talking about. And it's good for all sorts of outcomes besides just supporting any employee with a mental health concern. But it's especially important there because of all the things we talked about before, the concerns about self-esteem, the concerns about earnings, and other insecurities that are often coupled with having a mental health condition. And so we really want to make sure that people understand as managers that they have an obligation to invest in the behaviors that will create psychological safety. They also have to reinforce the group norms so the whole team is participating in this endeavor. It can't be just the manager. And if you do that, you will enable people to speak more openly. And we're not talking about the license to then share everything going on with your life. I mean, that's another concern I hear from managers is like, oh, we'll never get any work done because people are just opening up about everything. And again, like the people we talk to here, like they want to get the job done. They're very conscious of their responsibilities as a worker. But you have to loosen it up a little bit and allow them to bring out what's important to help them do that job. And leaders, one of the first things leaders can do to create psychological safety is to go first, is to share their own vulnerabilities or struggles or experiences that they've had as a manager where they learn something that helped them become better. It's really this sense of not just oversharing, but just being vulnerable enough to recognize that we're all doing the best we can. We all, like you said, have our struggles. And the more we talk about them and collaborate together on solving them, the better off we'll all be. But if you have a manager who's presenting as perfect, well, you're just not going to create that kind of psychological safety for anybody to come forward with a vulnerability.
Also, who trusts someone like that these
Yeah.
days?
I mean, everyone knows you're not perfect.
Right? It's like, okay, we get it. Yeah. So it's really interesting. I mean, I was, just as we leave, I'm curious. And when it comes to manager training, I often think about meetings, so group meetings, and then one-on-one check-ins. If I'm a manager listening to this and I suspect someone on my team might have bipolar, might be struggling, I want to be psychologically safe, what might I do in the next check-in one-on-one, or maybe in our next team meeting?
Well, what I will take directly from the mouths of the managers in our study who were doing a good job of this. And two of them in particular that I think about essentially ask the same question, which is, what do I need to know and how can I help you? And, you do not want to armchair diagnose someone on your team and go forward with, I've noticed, I'm wondering, don't do that. You are not qualified and you should never act as a therapist without that kind of training. But what you can do is reflect on observations you've had of when the person hasn't seemed to be at their best or is confused or seems, upset about something. And you can say, lead with, I want to make sure I'm as supportive as I can. So I need to know what I can do to make this better for you. Help me understand in a way that I can support you. So I think that's the first thing, is really a sincere invitation without telling people what's going on, without putting expectations of what they're going to tell you back. But then you have to follow up. And this is often forgotten. It's not about opening the conversation. It's about doing something with that information together. So this then becomes okay, thank you for sharing. That's really helpful for me to know. But let me make sure I get this right. Are you asking me to do this? Would this be helpful? How can we set up a way for us to follow up on this to make sure that I know if I'm doing, what's helpful to you? And also, here are the things that I would need back from you to make sure that we're all aligned in this endeavor together. So, a lot of times the managers that we heard about had a regular cadence every week of meeting one-on-one with that person, in which case those conversations became just so fluid and natural because they were just picking up on last week's conversation and following up. Like, we tried that this time. Did that work? Okay, no. All right. How about this next week? I see we have this big meeting ahead. Let's strategize a little bit. Like, how can we make this go the best it can? And when you hear that as a manager, you might think, oh my gosh, that's so much work. Like, I just want to tell them what to do and let them go do it. But it's not the best way to get the best out of your people. I always say, you hired these people for a reason. Don't you want their best? And so, you got to actually have a conversation, and then you got to do some stuff differently afterwards. But guess what? The other person's working super hard on the other end. So it's not just about you either. It's really a team effort if you can create that kind of environment. And then I would say, don't only do this in one-on-ones though. I think so much of this has to be shared among the group. Or you've just created one tiny safe space that makes this person feel very nervous outside of that one-on-one. And you don't want to create that kind of dependency. And you also want to make sure that you're inspiring and emboldening the rest of the team as a group.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much, Connie. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your research, and have a great day.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you for focusing on these issues and all the work you do.